Please pray with me. With the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Is everybody sweating?
No.
Glistening. It's glisten about me too. I'm glistening, sparkling. Let's talk about food. No, I don't mean it's time to go over and eat yet. We're just going to talk about food here. So I read somewhere that people living in the Civil War era were an average of 4 inches shorter than we are. I actually think that's a real understatement. I think it was much more than that. Has anyone ever been to Gettysburg, to the Cyclorama there? Have you looked at some of those uniforms of the men in the... Oh my goodness, they're so small. I mean, the guys seem like they're 5 foot, 5'2", and I feel like I'm an average height person at 5'10". It's just amazing how much smaller the people were. And it's all mainly because of food, the way we eat, the how good we are with our nutrition. Some of us really like food, and we'll get to enjoy that in a little bit. But food isn't all easy for all of us either. As much as some of us like food, sometimes too much food can be a problem, but sometimes just food in general can be a problem. Right, Darlene? Yes. We've got many of those who have celiac disease. That's one in my family too. My mom has gluten intolerance. And so there's a lot of food over there that people like Darlene and my mom would not be able to eat. Who else has food allergies? Joanne, unleash the list. We'll just suffice to say a lot. Suffice to say a lot of things. Yes. Some kids have, or some, especially you find out when your kids have lactose intolerance, so you can't eat any kind of milk or dairy. I've got friends who they can't eat any of those things, have gluten-free. Some people don't eat meat. For those people, I feel really sad for you. You're missing out on something amazing. So food's such a big part of our lives, and for some of us, it's a real awareness sort of thing. And so we're going to talk about food here this morning, and not the food over there, but the food that we are literally gathered around here. The food that is talked about in the gospel text for today, the food that we will be taking in just a moment, and then a lot of us have been taking all of our lives, the Eucharist. So first, I want to throw out a little bit of theology. We're going to get heady, because the people in Bible study this week found this to be helpful. You heard those words from the gospel about, this is my flesh, this is my blood, eat of it, and you'll have eternal life. Or there's a whole bunch of different images that are given there that Jesus gives. Very literally, that's where we get our language for our theology for communion. Jesus said, this is my body, this is my blood. And so we think that this is Jesus' body and blood. Our Catholic brothers and sisters, and this might actually be the place where we did not have Tim on Wednesday night, and we needed some clarification. And so maybe Tim will jump in here if I state something that's incorrect. But our Catholic brothers and sisters believe that when the words are spoken over communion here, like they will be in just a few moments, when we say these words, this is my body given for you, do this in remembrance of me. When we say the words, this is my blood given for you for the forgiveness of sins, our Catholic brothers and sisters would say that this bread and this wine literally changes into Jesus' body and blood. So when Jesus in the gospel says, this is my flesh and this is my blood, our Catholic brothers and sisters would say, amen, exactly like Jesus said it. When Luther read these words, and others like this in the scriptures, Luther came to the conclusion that when he held the bread and the wine in his hands, when he'd hold this, he'd say, well, even after I said the words, this still tastes like cardboard. He'd say, it still tastes like bread. It still tastes, let's imagine a loaf of bread, because that's more like what Luther would have had. It still tastes like wheat and like baking powder soda, whatever it is, and water and all the molasses, whatever the ingredients are in the bread. It still tastes like all those things. Or if he was holding the wine, he'd say, yes, it still tastes like water and alcohol and fermented grapes, even after the words have been spoken. And he probably bit his lip and tasted blood, and so he knew the distinction between the two. And so for Luther, there was a part of him that couldn't get past this reality that, well, they still are bread and wine in some capacity, and yet in the gospel and other places like it, Jesus says, this is my body. This is my flesh. This is my blood. And so Luther, brilliant scholar that he is, said that Jesus is literally in those things. They still remain bread and wine, and yet at the same time, they are Jesus' flesh. They are Jesus' blood. Jesus is, and here, right? Here's your catechetical words for all of you who did catechism. We would say that Jesus is in, with, and under the bread and the wine. Well, that brought any other person in Luther's day, and pretty much our day since then, to say the obvious question, well, how does that work? Explain that to us, Brother Martin. How is Jesus in, with, and under the wine or the bread? And you know what Martin Luther said? That's it. He said, I don't know. Yeah, it's faith. It's inexplainable. I don't know. And so here we are taking in this meal that is an I don't know sort of moment. And so this meal is an act of rebellion. Have you ever thought about communion being an act of rebellion? It's an act of rebellion, first of all, for that very fact that we can't explain it. We don't know it. Jesus declares it to be his body and blood. He declares it to be for the forgiveness of sins, and we can't explain any of that. He says, after we say the prayers, that this is his flesh, and we'll put it in our mouths and we'll eat it, and we'll just believe it, because we can't explain it away. So, in some ways, these are very visceral words, right? Those words from the gospel, eat my flesh, drink my blood. The Christians were called cannibals for a long, long time. The early first century Christians, they were called cannibals for using these sorts of words. So it's very visceral. And yet, at the same time, these words in the gospel are so intimate. Jesus uses this phrase, those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. There's a sensuality here, a closeness, an intimacy with Jesus that, again, can you explain it? No, but it's this beautiful, powerful moment that Christians have been doing for 2,000 years. Rebellion. A rebellious aspect of this meal is that it's all-inclusive. When Jesus says, my flesh given for all, my blood given for all, Jesus doesn't check to see if you're a man or a woman, or if you're black or white, or of what faith you declare yourself to be. Jesus just gives it. Jesus just gives this meal to all who come and put their hands out. And another amazing rebellious thing about this is when we come to receive this meal, I don't want to put my iPad down on the altar, in this intimate moment, in this tender moment, we put our hands out as beggars. A couple of you put like one hand out like this, or a couple of you, none of you here, obviously, none of you here, but a couple of people will try and pick it out of my hands, like I'm going to put it in their hands, and they're like, no one wants that piece now. I've held it like 2 or 3 times. But the beauty of this moment is we come, I'm not understanding it, not getting it, and so helplessly we put our hands out to receive it, like beggars to a feast. Like beggars to a feast we come. It is claimed that Luther's last words before he died was simply, we are beggars, it is true. And no better moment encapsulates this moment of begging than coming to the table, to the Eucharist, to the good gift, Eucharis, good gift. We have nothing to offer. We have nothing to give. And so historically, there's this other reality that historically we've often put confession right before communion. Maybe you who are a little bit older have been around the church, did you do that when you were younger? Confessed right immediately before you came to communion? Like we do it now at the beginning of the worship. I went to my wife's Methodist church last weekend, and they had communion. It was the 1 out of 4 times a month where they have communion. They miss out on this gift like we do every week. And they had confession right before communion. It's like prayers, offering, and then we confessed. Do you know why? For a long time, the church taught people that you had to be in a good enough mindset, right enough, sinlessness enough to come to the Eucharist. You had to purge yourself well enough. The sharing of the peace. We do it at the end of worship. Every other church you go to, where do they do it? Right before communion. You know why? So that you can go make amends with anybody you have issue with. Because for a long time, the church taught that you need to be right enough to receive communion. I still know people that, not in our church, thank goodness, but I've heard my colleagues talk about other people. They'll say, sometimes so-and-so won't come up for communion because they're in a fight with a family member or a friend. They just don't feel like they're worthy enough. Friends, if you are waiting to get good enough or right enough or clean enough or healthy enough or right enough in our relationships with each other or with God to come to this, you ain't never going to be welcome. And when I say you, I mean you and us all. So again, isn't that radical? Isn't that a rebellious moment? another gift that we don't have to achieve in life, another moment where it isn't up to us and our righteousness, our goodness. Think about last week I had justification and sanctification. Here is a sanctification moment for us because God has already done justification for us. This rebellious moment of the good gift where we do nothing to earn it. And so my final conclusion about why this is a rebellious moment is a very personal insight for me. Last fall, actually about a year ago now, I started going through like this. Well, we'll just say I started to understand evil and the devil, or however you want to put that, in a different way. And I'm sure we all go through these sort of experiences in life where things, the ebbs and flows of life, and we experience things in new and different sorts of ways. And so I was experiencing evil. I called it evil because I have a hard time like saying the devil or Satan. But so evil was a new real in my life. And one day, as things were particularly bad, I was standing there. So this is what happens in your pastor's head in the middle of communion sometimes. As I was standing here in this moment of communion, and it was the moment where I was standing up here actually holding the chalice. And we say, again, after supper, he took the cup and he gave thanks, and he gave it to his disciples, and he said, "Take and eat, this is my blood for the forgiveness of sin. Do this in the remembrance of me." I remember standing up here and holding it up high and thinking, screw you, evil. In this moment of holiness, I was able to hold on to Jesus' body and blood in a way that I couldn't understand. But in this moment of the Eucharist, in this moment of goodness and grace, it wasn't a very nice thought. But when you're battling evil sometimes, it's not a very nice thing. But I remember coming to this meal and being able to hold these elements in my hand and thinking, take this, evil. I am a child of God. I am protected by God. And God has given me this gift. Even with all the evil that is in me, or all the bad, or the yucky, or the messed up relationships that's in me in that moment, God still gives me this gift. And so that's what this rebellious moment is for us right now. The Lord be with you. Lift up your hearts. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.